Okay, now we go through the time practice on micro essay that you have done on Thursday this week. The question that I've selected is the NYJC prelim question in 2012. I would suggest that this is actually quite an important question, and as it covers a lot of very basic concepts in elasticity. So for part A, basically you are asked to illustrate with examples, explain PED, YED and XED. Okay, so quite a straightforward question. You are asked to explain, and you are supposed to ask to explain the three elasticity of demand concepts, PED, YED and XED, and also to give relevant examples. So your relevant examples is the context. So let us look at the level descriptors. Maybe you want to take some time to just have a quick read. Okay, if you need more time, maybe you can pause the video and spend some time reading it. Okay, but the key thing here is that when we ask you to explain the three concepts, we have a few things in mind that you should cover. Okay, and these are the definitions, the signs, the coefficients, and brief factors affecting the elasticities. Okay, and of course I want you to give examples and justifications. Okay, so basically there are two ways that you can go through this question. One way is to explain in separate paragraphs, each of the paragraph covering each of these 4 points. Okay, the other way, which I will take in this review, is to use a comparison approach, meaning I will organize my essay based on these categories like definitions, signs, coefficients, etc. And within, say for example, within each of these categories, say for example the signs category, I will talk about PED, XED, YED. Okay, so in each of these criteria, you get a chance to compare and see how the three elasticity concepts differ or are similar. I felt that this approach would be better for revision purposes. Okay, I will not have too many examples, but in your essay you should include examples. Okay, I'll just leave the examples to you. Okay, so let us look at a breakdown of this question. In the introduction, you should define the three elasticity concepts, and if possible, include the equations. Okay, if you don't include the equations in the intro, you might want to include them in the body itself. Okay, so in the body, I will explain and indeed differentiate between these three concepts based on these categories. Okay, so these categories are basically taken from the level descriptors, and you should know that these are the few main things about elasticity concepts that you should take note. Okay, so basically the interpretation of the definitions, the signs, the coefficients, and how do you show PED, XED, YED on the demand and supply diagram, and what are some of the factors affecting each of them. Okay, lastly, the usual conclusion for part A, you just summarize your answers. Okay, so let's start. In the intro, you define PED, XED, YED. So I believe you can find this in the lecture booklet. PED basically measures the responsiveness of quantity demanded of a good due to a change in its own prices, ceteris paribus. Okay, I want you to take note of all the colored and bolded words and phrases in this definition, because you need to have it for a full definition. And it is also important because it highlights how is it different in each of the three definitions. Okay, in XED, the definition is that it measures the responsiveness of demand, okay, of a good due to a change in price of a related good, ceteris paribus. So if I put these two definitions together, can you see what are the differences? Price elasticity of demand, it is the responsiveness of quantity demanded. Why is it quantity demanded? Because it is due to a change in its own price. So this is a price factor or a price determinant. Okay, XED measures the responsiveness of demand. And why is it demand? Because it is due to a change in the price of related good. Now, price of related good is a non-price factor of demand for the good that is in question. Okay, don't be confused by this. So finally, for income, same thing, because income is a non-price determinant of demand, so it also measures the responsiveness of demand and not quantity demanded. Okay, and make sure you have all the ceteris paribus in there present in your definitions. Okay. Moving on, so we want to now explain PED, XED, YED in terms of how I interpret the definitions. Okay, so because clearly they are different concepts, right, and they are therefore relevant in very different circumstances. PED is only relevant when there is a change in the price of the good itself. This change in price can be due to anything. It can be due to the imposition of taxes like GST. That is what I've done in the lecture, the most recent lecture, that is due to a rise in GST. It could also be due to an increase in supply. Basically, anything that is supply related results in a change in its own price, and PED will be relevant. Okay, XED is relevant only when you have two goods. Okay, it is only relevant when you have a change in the price of a substitute or a complement good. Okay, so these are the related goods. This means that in the question, I must clearly see two different goods. Like for example, Coke and Pepsi, budget airlines and full fare airlines. Okay, so these are clearly different types of goods and services. Now, sometimes the goods and services may not be very obvious. You have to be sharp enough to catch it. Let me give you an example. Depending on the question, a normal taxi ride versus a limousine taxi ride would be different. Okay, a normal taxi ride is your normal small taxi, right? If you hire a limousine taxi, that means the big Mercedes taxis. Okay, it can be considered two different goods depending on the question, depending on the context that you are discussing. So you have to be very careful when you are dealing with XED. So finally, YED is only relevant when there is a change in income, and some of the phrases that will illustrate a change in income would be things like accelerating or slowing economic growth, economic recession or economic boom, things like downturn. Okay, so these words you must be very familiar, and when you see these words, you must be immediately link it to YED. Okay, next let us look at the signs on the PED, XED and YED. Okay, so different signs on the different coefficients of PED, XED and YED would have different meanings. Okay, for example, for PED, by law of demand it should be negative. Okay, but by convention we always present it as a positive number for PED. For XED, if the sign is negative, it shows that the relationship between these two goods are complements. But if it's positive, then the relationship between the two goods are actually substitutes. Okay? For YED, if it's negative, then the good is an inferior good. But if it's positive, the good is a normal good. Okay? After we talk about the signs, then we want to talk about the coefficients of PED, XED and YED. Okay? And different magnitudes on the coefficients would have very different meanings. For example, for PED, we generally denote two areas, two regions in magnitude. When it is from 0 to 1, we say that this good has demand that is price inelastic, and therefore the quantity demanded will change less than proportionately to a change in price. Okay, this price refers to the own price of the good. Okay. Therefore, the quantity demanded is not very responsive to price changes. Okay. In contrast, if it's PED greater than 1, we say that the good has demand that is price elastic, and that quantity demanded change more than proportionately to a change in price. Okay. Therefore, the quantity demanded for that good is very responsive to price changes. Okay. For XED, if the number is smaller than -1, then they are strong complements, meaning they are very good complements of each other. You cannot consume one good without consuming the other good. Okay, so the classic example would be tennis racket and tennis ball. Okay, so if the value of XED is from 0 to -1, we say that these are weak complements. Okay. Similarly, when it is XED greater than 1, we call the two goods strong substitutes, because they are either very similar to each other, or they are regarded as almost identical to each other. So they are strong substitutes. Okay. If XED is from 0 to 1, then these are weak substitutes. Okay. So the key thing here is this. We are interested in whether the demand for good X, okay, which is the good in question, the good that we are interested in, whether it changes more than or less than proportionately due to a change in price of the other related good Y. Okay. Moving on to YED, if it's from 0 to if it's from 0 to 1, we call it a necessity. Okay, and if YED is greater than 1, it is luxury goods. Now, for YED less than 1, these are inferior goods, but we do not differentiate between 0 to -1, and YED less than -1. So there's a typo here. This should be -1. Okay. So again, here we are interested in whether the demand for the good changes more than or less than proportionately to a change in income. Okay. So maybe I always believe that it is best to see using a number line for this kind of understanding in signs and coefficients. If it's PD 0 to 1, it is price inelastic. From 1 to infinity, it is price elastic. For XED less than 0, so this point here is 0, they are complements. And within complements, you are split to weak and strong complements. Similarly, substitutes, if it's greater than 1, and you can split into weak and strong substitutes. For YED, as long as it's positive, we refer to it as normal goods. And if it's income inelastic, meaning YED from 0 to 1, we call it necessities. And if it's income elastic, then YED is greater than 1. These are luxury goods. For goods that have a negative YED, we call this inferior goods. Okay, so like I said, we don't differentiate between the two regions as long as it is inferior good. So how do you show it in the ADAS diagram? For PED, it is illustrated by the gradient of the demand curve. So the gradient of the demand curve reflects the responsiveness of quantity demanded to a price change. Okay, let me just give you an example. Right here, what happened is that we have a price change from P0 to P1. Okay, and if the good has demand that is price inelastic, quantity demanded is not responsive to price change, so quantity demanded only falls by a small amount from Q0 to Q1. Okay, from Q0 to Q1. But if demand is price elastic, then the quantity demanded will be highly responsive to price changes, and therefore you see a greater fall from Q0 to Q2 given the same price increase. Okay, moving on. So now we cover YED. So YED, instead of being illustrated as a gradient of the demand curve, it is illustrated by the magnitude of shifts in the demand curve when income changes. Okay, so let us assume that there's a rise in income. Look at this diagram. If it's an inferior good, then demand will fall, as illustrated by this leftward shift of the demand curve. Okay, but if it's a normal good, then the demand curve would shift to the right. So D2 and D3 are demand curves for goods that are normal. Okay, but we make a distinction here, and if it's a luxury good, then it would see a greater shift rightwards of the demand curve when there is a rise in income. Okay, because the demand for these goods are highly responsive to a change in income. So for necessities have demand which is not very responsive to income changes. So even if there is a rise in income, it only sees a small increase in demand. Okay, therefore there is only a small shift to the right from D0 to D2. Okay, this is for necessities. Okay. So now we move on to XED. So let us assume that there is a rise in the price of substitutes. Okay, so when there is a rise in price of substitutes, the demand for the good that we are interested in would increase. Okay, so if it's a weak substitute, then you only see a relatively small increase in demand. But if there are strong substitutes, then you see that when there is a rise in price of the substitute, all the people who used to buy the substitute will come to buy my goods. Okay, because they are strong substitutes. So XED is greater than 1. Okay, and you see a relatively large increase in demand. So the best way to think about it is Pepsi and Coke. If the price of Pepsi increase, then because Pepsi and Coke are such strong substitutes, you will see a very significant rise in demand for Coke. Therefore, there will be a large shift in demand for Coke. Okay. For this explanation, I only took into account a rise in price of the substitute. Okay, so you must make sure that you can also explain other possible scenarios, like a fall in price of substitute, or a fall in price of complements, or a rise in price of complements. Okay, so you must be able to explain. So what are some of the brief factors affecting each of these? Okay, so you should be able to see most of this in your lecture booklet, so I'll do it quickly. PED, depending on what kind of acronym you learn, but the most important one, in my opinion, is the number and closeness of substitutes, and I feel that this is generally the most important determinant of PED. Okay. The other one will be degree of necessity, and there are a few others which I don't list down. For YED, it would depend on the income level of the person that we are talking about. For example, for a student or someone who has low income, the new iPhone 5S may be a luxury good, and therefore YED is much greater than 1. But for a businessman, for example, who needs the security of the fingerprint sensor, then the Apple iPhone 5S would be a necessity. Okay, so they will have YED that is between 0 and 1. Okay, so it really depends on the income level of the individual we are talking about. And of course, we also need to consider the nature of the good. Okay, so whether it is a agricultural food product, or is it like a manufactured good like iPhones and computers and things like that. Okay. For XED, again, it depends on the nature of the good. Okay, so it is quite natural that things like tea and coffee, they are substitutes of each other, but things like tea and sugar are complements. Okay, but of course it depends on people's perception of these products. In Hong Kong, where they drink their coffee and tea together, there's a drink called Yuan Yang, right? If you go Hong Kong or even Taiwan. So if that's the case, if people perceive that coffee and tea go so well together, then coffee and tea can become a complement. It really depends on how you argue the point across, right? So the next step is actually to conclude. Okay, but I'll leave the conclusion to you because it's just a summary of the essay. And with that, I will actually want to go on to part B of the question.